Welcome to A Human Perspective. On this episode of A Human Perspective, I have Keisha Akinwunmi, who is a global mobility lead at Netflix. We've both had very interesting backgrounds, with me having startup scale up, and Keisha has predominantly worked for large global corporate companies. And I thought it would be a good idea to actually talk about our different experiences in both spaces. So welcome, Keisha, to A Human Perspective.
Thank you very much for having me. Very excited to be on this segment of this show. Thank you for the introduction. Just to give a little bit more meat to the bones in terms of my background. So, I am what you'd probably consider a specialist in mobility. I've
Yeah.
been in mobility for, quite a while now, maybe 13, 14 years, revealing my age there. Started off in banking, which is where I learned my
Yeah.
craft. And then since then, I've done a stint in mining, journalism, worked in what you'd consider sports retail, and now, as you mentioned, Netflix. So every time I've moved into a different organization, it's been very different to the last one. So probably less traditional, more dynamic, more fast-paced, and very different in very different ways, but
Yeah.
always been global mobility.
What would you say are some of the pros of working with large organizations overall, large established businesses?
Oh God, that's a good question. I would say usually good amount of processes in
Hmm.
place.
Hmm.
Resource is
Yeah.
always usually in abundance. Money,
Yeah.
not always the case, because obviously there's times where budgets and money can be an issue. But
Yeah.
generally speaking, the multinationals, the big corporate firms, have a lot more disposable income, which can make your work a little bit more easier. From that perspective, I would say it's the financial safety and security in being able to execute your work and not having to always fight to get things done.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say in terms of startup scale ups, for me, the pros are definitely the ability to have an impact, which I think is pretty difficult in a large organization, simply
Hmm.
because everybody has a lane in a large organization.
Right,
And it's the same in a startup scale up, but your lane is much wider.
right.
So the remit that you cover and the influence that you can have and the impact that you can make is much more visible in a smaller organization. Definitely agree, you don't always have the funding. So you have to be a bit more creative sometimes as to how you reach the solution. And then sometimes you just have to be a bit more realistic as well.
Well, I would say, I mean, having just heard that from you,
Yeah.
it puts things into perspective. When
Mm.
you work for a smaller firm where money isn't always there, or you have to be more creative, as you say,
Yeah.
I would definitely say that makes you have to think outside of the box, and it's going to
Sadly.
challenge you in a different way. And if you can work and succeed in that ecosystem, you
Yeah.
can probably work in any ecosystem, because once you've got the ability and the traits to be able to navigate in uncertainty, or you have to create something out of nothing, it shows your skill set. So I would definitely say that's very applaudable.
Yeah, thank you. But I would say the other side is when you are in a larger corporate business, then actually learning how to navigate the layers of that business, the people who are decision makers within that business is also an amazing skill. What would you say about your experience around that?
Lots of pros working for multinationals and big corporations, but it does have its challenges as well. Sometimes it can be quite hierarchical. There
Mm,
could be many, many layers to get sign off. So by the time you've gotten to where you need to get it to, it's a task in itself. And that
yeah.
takes a lot of time. Whereas in a smaller, more medium-sized company, there's less layers and there's less people
Mm,
to go to. So that sometimes has been quite frustrating
mm,
in the past. It can be quite bureaucratic. I
yeah.
have to say that's one thing I'm experiencing less working at Netflix compared to other organizations I've worked for. It's probably one of the smallest organizations I've ever worked for,
So weird
where
to hear.
right, exactly. I mean, I've worked for organizations where there's been 100,000 employees globally,
Wow.
whereas now we're at 10,000 globally.
Mm.
So in comparison, it's the equivalent of maybe what I would consider your world, which is a small
Yeah.
startup in comparison.
Yeah.
which sounds absolutely ridiculous given it's Netflix. It's a well-established, strong company, but given
Yeah.
where I've come from, so I really enjoy the fact that there's less layers there. A lot of decisions can sit with an informed captain, and an informed captain is anyone who is going to make good decisions for the business, which sounds a lot more simple than it is, but it really just boils down to that. You have to ask yourself questions like, is this going to benefit the business? Is
Yeah.
this in the interest of the business? Can you do the calculations and sums in your head to weigh
Yeah.
up the pros and cons? If you can do that and you feel confidently to be able to, if someone was to challenge you or ask you why you did that, you could articulate that,
Yeah.
then you can go ahead and make that decision. Whereas I haven't always had that working for
Right.
previous organizations. So I definitely feel like I'm in a better space in being able to do that. But over the years, it has been very challenging, very
Yeah.
bureaucratic, and sometimes it's been a little bit painful, especially when you feel like you're just up against processes. And Netflix
Yeah.
is all about people over process. So there's been
Mm.
pros and cons over the years. So I feel like I'm definitely in a better space, but I've had my fair share of challenges, and I can imagine anyone can relate to what I'm saying if you work for a large multinational. What's the experience for you now in terms of if you need to make a decision now or get something signed off? I'd be very interested to know what would that look like?
It depends. Sometimes I will make the decision myself. So if I feel this is quite small, it doesn't really impact anyone, then I will go ahead and make a decision. Sometimes it is questioned, but I actually have also found over the years, you've got to help management get comfortable with trusting
Right,
you
right.
and the decisions you make. I do also find it does depend on the culture of the business, even for a
Hmm.
small business. So the way
Hmm.
it's led and the cultural way of working within that business can make decisions easier or harder. So the amount of ownership that you're given really depends on the culture of business and the type of manager you have.
Right. It's one of two things. It's definitely down to the culture of the
Yes,
organization, but
for
I
sure.
also feel in smaller, more media-sized companies, it's easier to apply that
Oh,
approach. Whereas
100%.
larger organizations, they're sometimes very set in their ways in terms of how
Mm,
you want to do things, and you've just got to follow the steps, regardless the fact that maybe some of those steps are absolutely redundant, time
mm, mm.
consuming. You've just got to do it. And if you weren't to stick to it, you would be reprimanded.
What do you think keeps people in cultures like that?
Sometimes people just don't know that it can be different elsewhere. For some people, they're easily bucketed or that's what they know. You can work for an organization for 5, 10 years. If you've always worked for a law firm or a bank, that's all you know. And then you kind of fall in line. You become accustomed to that way of working and you don't know any different. I can tell you now that 90% of the people who join Netflix, once they come across the culture, our tolerance for freedom and responsibility and making decisions, you would think everyone would jump up and down and be like, oh, this is great. But actually, a lot of
Yeah.
people struggle with it because they're not
Wow.
used to it. They're absolutely not used to it. So someone says, yeah, you can sign off €1 million or £1 million. And you think, what? I would never be able to do that in my previous organization. That's a
Yeah.
sum that would have to go to the CEO and
Hmm.
whoever. And now you're saying, actually, I can make that decision. And then you're like, oh, wow, I really need to think about this because I don't want to get this wrong. You know?
Yes. Wow.
And then the burden and the challenge falls on your shoulders. Whereas if you're in a larger organization, if something goes wrong, more than likely 10 pair of eyes have had
Mm.
visibility to that sign off and to
Yes.
that
Yeah.
decision. So you're almost cushioned by the different layers of people because you're like, oh well, my
Yeah.
boss knows about it, my boss's boss knows about it. But you've made that decision at Netflix. So a
Mm.
lot of people actually really struggle and
Mm.
it takes time. So what we advocate is talk to others, and we also have this approach called sunshining. Talk to a colleague and you say, look, I'm thinking of doing this.
Mm.
What do you think? What would you do? And you're not obligated to go with your colleague's decision or approach, but
Yeah.
it just shows that you're collaborating
Yeah.
with your team and you're getting different perspectives because you never know what someone else might bring to the table and give you a different view.
Mm.
And then once you've spoken to enough people, if you feel confident enough to move forward with your decision,
Yeah.
regardless of what the different voices said, then that's absolutely fine.
You mentioned freedom and responsibility.
Hmm.
I want to dive into that a little bit more because it's a very famous Netflix slide, but
Oh, yeah.
I'm very curious as to what that looks like internally. So, firstly, I think maybe it would be a good idea for you to tell us when Netflix talks about freedom and responsibility, what do they mean?
We're not like other organizations where we have policies
Mm.
and
Wow.
guidelines. So that is what we may consider freedom and responsibility. However, there's certain elements embedded where we say act in Netflix's best interest.
Mm.
I can give you examples of situations and someone who isn't at a senior level has had to make a call because they weren't able to get in touch with someone a bit more senior. There was a presentation that needed to take place. The person couldn't get in touch with the audio team, and this individual ran out and bought quite an expensive bit of equipment,
Yeah.
set it up. We were able to use it for the presentation. Now, his managers were said that was a great idea, but actually
Yeah.
he took the initiative and said, I'm going to do that. And that's in Netflix's best interest.
You also use this term informed captain. So trusting informed captains to make a decision. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
If I take my role, for example, I look after mobility
Mm.
for EMEA,
Yeah.
which means I look after all moves that come into EMEA or across EMEA. And if I feel that, and of course, I have leaders and stakeholders above me who I can
Yeah.
always engage and talk to. If
Yeah.
I feel I'm more knowledgeable, which my boss
Mm.
who is based in the US would say I would be for the EMEA
Yeah.
region, he would consider me the informed captain. Whereas in another
Got you.
organization, he would always be considered the informed captain. So he would
Just based on
just based
seniority.
on seniority. But other stakeholders would say, okay, yes, her boss is in this position and he sits in the world headquarters, but actually he doesn't know the ecosystem like Keisha does in EMEA. So is it right that he should be someone making a decision for EMEA as opposed to
Mm.
someone who's in EMEA, understands their own ecosystem? And that's how you may be defined as the informed captain.
That is really interesting.
My boss could actually give me a particular decision and I don't have to go with that
Mm.
decision.
What?
He or she could say, well, I would recommend you do this. And then I could
Yeah.
say, well, okay, thank you very much, but I'm actually going to do something else. And he or she would say, okay, fine, go ahead. But that responsibility, if you go ahead, it still weighs on you, right?
Yeah.
That's where you have to be like, am I really making a really good call? Right. So that's
Yeah.
where
Let me think about this again.
right, exactly. So that's practically unheard of in any other organization.
Yeah, no. Wow. The concept of your manager saying, hey, look, this is what I would do, but you can still, as the informed captain,
Overall, yeah,
actually make your own decision. Yeah. And
100%.
overall.
Hmm.
So if you were to have your own company, let's say you had your own startup, do you feel that's something that can be applied to another environment?
100%. I'm a big advocate of Netflix, and naturally, I would be working for them.
Mm-mm.
It definitely works for more smaller organizations, and I still consider Netflix relatively small as
With
yeah,
10,000
yeah,
employees. Yes.
exactly, exactly. In comparison to other companies that I've worked for, you've got to make really smart decisions, not
Yeah.
just in terms of approaches you apply, but the people you hire. One
Mm.
thing Netflix does is we hire really smart people, really
Mm.
smart and experienced people, and that's where it starts. So you've got to
Right.
make sure first and foremost that your organization is ideally filled with people
Mm.
like that, with who you can trust to make adult business decisions.
Hmm. You highlighted Netflix hires very smart people and
Hmm.
very experienced people.
Correct.
When you go to a startup, what you'll find is highly likely the hires will be smart, but not necessarily very experienced, especially where a company is starting out. They've got minimum budget. They're actually relying on less experienced or junior people to build out and grow their business. And I do wonder, what is the impact of that? So actually hiring more people who are junior but less experienced versus having a smaller team of more experienced smart people. I do wonder if you were to put those two companies together doing exactly the same thing, which one would go further and why?
It really is. It's a debatable one, depending on the
Yeah.
organization. But I
Yeah.
can tell you from Netflix approach, it's why have two free people doing the same role when you can hire one rock star to do the role. Someone faster, more efficient, compensate them really well, and you let
Yeah.
them get on with
Mm,
it. And you
mm.
let them make decisions and treat them like adults, and everyone has a voice at the table as opposed
Yeah.
to junior individuals. So you've got to invest more time, you've got to
Mm,
oversee them, you've got to
yeah.
potentially course correct their work. This takes up
Mm,
time. But which lane's going to move quicker? The person who's a rock star,
yeah.
who's efficient, who's super experienced, who can run and you can trust and you don't have to watch
Yeah.
their work, or free individuals where you've got to, oh, can I see your email before
Yeah.
you make a decision? And also they're uncomfortable making a decision as well. And you may not want them making decisions depending
Yeah.
on the topic at hand. So
Yeah.
it's definitely a discussion for debate, but I can definitely see the pros.
It's this quantity over quality
Right,
debate. And I do think on both sides, it can be difficult to scale, because if you have too many experienced people, you've got too many chefs in the kitchen.
right,
And then if you have too many junior people, well, someone needs to help us set a bar, set the
right,
tone. They're not going to
right,
just know things.
right,
They need to be taught, coached, etc.
right.
You're expecting people to learn on the job,
Yeah.
but what will happen is they'll just learn how to do that job, not necessarily the best job.
There's also pros to bringing in more junior, maybe less experienced individuals. They often bring a different perspective
True.
to the
True.
business and to the way of doing things, as opposed to someone who's super seasoned, 10, 15 years. They have a fresh lens. With an
Yes. Yeah.
experienced individual, maybe they're a little bit more set in their
Mm,
ways,
mm,
whereas maybe
mm.
someone who's a bit more junior is more moldable.
Yeah, definitely moldable and like a sponge,
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And they often can be quite enthusiastic and eager. Not to say you can't get that on the other side as well. So
Mm-hmm,
once again,
mm-hmm.
it does depend on your business, but
Yep,
definitely
yep,
if you're a smaller scale startup company, I would question why you would bring in less experience and junior people
yep,
into
yep.
that kind of organization. But this is me. I've never worked in that environment before.
Mm-mm.
Can you tell me a little bit about your experience in terms of, the organization
Yeah.
you worked for from that perspective?
Sometimes it is just a matter of budget. You can also hire very smart junior people as well. I think sometimes it's just down to the individual.
Mm,
Sometimes you just see some people flourish. They understand how to learn. Sometimes you see people do amazing things
right.
and it's their first job.
Wow.
So it does boil down to the individual. The cons are exactly what you have already flagged. It's the investment of time. It's a pro and a con,
Mhm.
because you do get something from it as a human being. Like, okay, I know
Right.
I've helped these individuals grow,
Right.
but the con is that actually the business itself has its own deadlines, targets that don't wait for people to learn. So actually, you're working in a way trying to get people to where they need to be so that we're working more efficiently, and you can lose time doing that, especially working completely remotely. Because usually what would happen in an office is there's that instant sharing, that instant, oh, what's happening there? And so the learning is a lot quicker.
Right.
What I found actually is working completely remotely, it's just as and when someone decides to drop you a message or wants to jump on a Zoom, that you learn something, that you overhear something. And so that kind of does slow down progress. I feel for grads now, where a lot of companies are going completely remote, because businesses really do need to think about how they help people learn and grow quickly so that they're able to make an impact quickly. That is a challenge. It's going to be an even bigger challenge now that we're remote.
Interesting to hear.
I'll ask you a little bit about being treated as adults, which I know is a huge thing at Netflix. One person that I listen to is Patty McCord, who is the ex-chief people officer, and she often talks
Sounding.
about freedom and responsibility. That key phrase, treating employees like adults. Yes, we know we're hiring adults, but there are always these rules, regulations that we have to follow and adhere to. So when you say that you're treating employees as adults or treating people within the organization as adults, what does that realistically look like?
I just really love working in an environment where I'm treated like an adult. I've worked for more, corporate companies where you're monitored, you're treated like a child, you're not
Yeah.
treated like an adult. And it's very frustrating. It's super,
Yeah.
super frustrating not to be able to make decisions that you feel are going to benefit, or to move quickly and efficiently without speaking to X, Y, and so many people. It's allowing our workforce to feel empowered to make decisions and to make actions that are really going to benefit them, their team, and the organization overall.
All right, brilliant. We can go on talking forever. We should definitely have a follow-up chat. I've really enjoyed everything that we've talked on so far. Thank you so much for your time, Keisha.
Thank you for having me.
This episode started out as a conversation about differences between large company culture versus small company culture. But it actually evolved into a sneak peek of what life is like inside Netflix and why the company is so successful. The concept of freedom and responsibility is easier said than done. But I believe Keisha has shared some key steps to reaching this utopia. 1. Hire the right people. 2. compensate them well. 3, trust them and treat them like adults. 4, empower your people to make decisions. I hope you found this conversation insightful. It's certainly given me food for thought when it comes to the type of culture I want to cultivate within my own team. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I will see you in the next episode.